Hello friends, welcome back to HorrorScoped, where today we'll be taking a trip down a rabbit hole. No, not the 2 a.m. Wikipedia dive where you just can't stop yourself. This one leads us to a playhouse, if you consider an orphanage to be a playhouse. We of course are referring to Mr. Hopp's Playhouse 1 and 2, and the story that is woven throughout. We'll be looking at the lore from the series' first entry and its sequel, so I hope you enjoy. To begin this story, we have to go back, and to go back, we have to go forward. Good thing we won't need roads for this. With this idea of going into the past in mind, I have to point out how much this game feels like a few games from days gone by, those being Home Alone and Home Alone 2 back on the Super Nintendo. I can't help but be taken back to my childhood, at least momentarily, with the similar gameplay. Ah, nostalgia. Memories aside, I was heading somewhere with the time travel joke, as the second game in the series serves as the prequel to the first, so chronologically speaking, it makes the most sense to start there. Mr. Hopp's Playhouse 2 begins by welcoming you to Blacklands Manor, the orphanage mentioned a few moments ago. Our protagonist is a young girl named Esther, a resident of this home located in the United Kingdom. The year is 1952, but the manor has in fact been around for nearly 300 years, since its initial construction in the 1600s. The surrounding area, the Blacklands, has a dark history attached to it. There is some foreboding foreshadowing. Back in the present day, Esther has found herself in the unlucky position of having frequent nightmares. Recurring, in fact. This awful dream set and repeat features a toy rabbit that transforms into a shadowy monster and chases Esther throughout the manor. When the rabbit inevitably catches her in its claws, she experiences a frightening vision of a girl being burned alive. The dream then abruptly ends and Esther finds herself troubled, but still in her own bed. Her friends, Molly and Isaac, confront her about the nightmare as Esther had in fact woken them up as well. A repeat occurrence, and one that seems to be wearing on their nerves. Isaac seems to be more understanding of her plight than Molly, who claims that Esther is perhaps losing her mind. This would possibly be a reasonable conclusion to arrive upon if it weren't for the fact that that toy in her dream, although less shadowy, arrived that very morning. A matron at Blacklands Manor, Beverly, soon approached the children with a box of donated toys, from which each child would pick one. Molly chose a panda, who she named Miss Bo. Isaac, despite believing they appeared quite creepy, he was right, chose a tiger and named it Mr. Stripes. Esther, of course, chose the rabbit, Mr. Hopp. This is where things really start to go south. Poltergeist-like activity begins to occur with this toy rabbit, as it seemingly moves on its own. Esther's dreams grow even more harrowing, as they change after this rabbit's arrival. No longer is she simply chased. She now has a more lucid experience, as though she was exploring the manor while awake. But things are off. There are strange glyphs she finds while walking the grounds in her dream. These symbols, engraved upon medallions, are revealed in some detail through a note Esther finds during her dream walk. The symbols, known simply as the Six, were first discovered on ancient hieroglyphics, worn by a pharaoh as medallions on a necklace. They have had many appearances throughout history, the latest being in 1876. Their existence is somewhat shrouded in myth. If Esther is careful and thorough in her exploration of the orphanage, she can acquire these medallions after undergoing a form of trial for each one. Soon after the discovery of all 6 of these symbols, a fire erupts within her dreamed manor. Extinguishing these flames may have been for the best, but Esther soon discovers an entity in the remaining embers. The entity, to be exact. A being expanded upon within a subsequent note that is revealed to be the evil feared by many religions and practices. Evil, that is, with a capital E, as they are the very devil themselves. The story the note provides is a parallel to the story of Lucifer from the classic Paradise Lost, which we have mentioned in previous lore entries on different games. Things quickly become more dire as the entity begins to stalk Esther, even in broad daylight, and takes the other children hostage via its influence through the other 2 toys. Esther had her work cut out for her. Esther, of course, set out to find her captured friends. During her efforts, another child named Dee arrived at the orphanage. Dee immediately sets off some alarm bells as she's seemingly aware of the less than holy activity occurring around the building. Equally bad is the fact that the matrons don't seem to care that the children have gone missing, believing them to simply be misbehaving. This all leads to another nightmare for Esther to navigate, one which leads us to a looping corridor with a story to tell. The painting within seems to tell the tale of a girl, perhaps the one Esther has dreamed of in the fire. This girl is seen with the matron in one of the paintings, much like Esther herself. These paintings progress to show the girl interacting with the entity and taking the necklace of the Six from it. An interesting point to make here is that Esther is able to come across an aged version of the first painting while awake, which links the waking and dream worlds even closer. As she progresses, the subsequent paintings grow even darker. As we mentioned earlier, this estate has been around since the 1600s. These paintings seem to be illustrating events from that time period. The picture girl is punished for straying into the woods, and ultimately burned at the stake for witchcraft. The paintings depict her being questioned prior to her execution for the murder of a matron, something Esther experiences firsthand just before she sees this painting, as she receives a vision of this woman being torn apart by supernatural forces. The dream certainly shows that there was no remorse for this act either, as she deserved it, is carved into the wall to the left of the painting. Ultimately, the townsfolk capture the girl, and her end is illustrated in the final paintings. Eventually, the messages Esther finds scrawled into the walls begin to address her directly, the entity seemingly desiring her for the next vessel. When Esther next awakens, she discovers her friends have not only been locked in the closet, but also completely possessed by the demon through the toys. Matron Beverly, seemingly aware to some degree of what was happening, stops Esther before she can do anything to help her friends and locks her in the cellar. The entity intervenes here, killing the matron, which ultimately allows Esther to escape back to the manor upstairs. During her trek through the basement, she solidifies the fact that these toys are what is anchoring the demon to her friends, and that, through Mr. Hopp, the entity is trying to do the same to her. Esther encounters Dee once more when she makes it back to the manor, and seems to have a plan for banishing the darkness from the grounds. Dee, already somewhat suspicious because she's a child with apparent knowledge on how to exorcise a demon, sends Esther on a fetch quest for the ritual's required items. The suspiciousness is more than confirmed upon Esther's return, where Dee is revealed to not only be possessed by the entity, but she's in fact the girl from the paintings. Dee has been pulling all the strings, including the donation of the toys themselves. A fight between the two ensues, and, well, I hope you still got the DeLorean, because we have some time traveling to do. Esther awakens in an unfamiliar place, in an unfamiliar time. Welcome to 2019, the first Mr. Hopp's Playhouse, and the home of its protagonist, Ruby, Esther's granddaughter. The entity's method of attack changes here, switching from force to manipulation, trying to, through Dee, convince Esther that they are the same, that they share a similar pain from their upbringings in the orphanage. Esther's will is resilient, however, and she resists these mental attempts at persuasion. So impressive is her willpower, in fact, that she is outright able to push back the entity itself. Where Dee's mind was taken over upon wearing the Six, Esther actually takes control of the Six's power. With it, she is drawn into the entity's own domain, and frees the souls it has taken, up to and including Dee. Esther defeats the entity with a Six and returns to the orphanage with all the freed spirits in tow. From here, it is important to note that the entity was defeated, but not destroyed. Esther's life returned to some level of normalcy, and as was foreshadowed, she eventually had a family. However, all the while, she was using her formidable willpower to hold the entity at bay. With this in mind, she held onto the Six and the Mr. Hopp toy for this very purpose. Unfortunately, with age comes the deterioration of the mind all too often. Eventually, the entity gained the upper hand, and we fully arrive at the events of the first entry of the series. Ruby is gifted the Mr. Hopp toy by Esther at the game's beginning, as the entity intends for her to be its next vessel. Esther had passed away quite suddenly, and we were able to piece together her slow decline, as the entity took hold through cassette tapes scattered throughout the house. She would evidently go through long spells of staring at the wall, only to be snapped out of it with no recollection of it having ever occurred. Esther's deterioration continued as her memory and cleanliness faltered further, and she would even wake screaming in the night. The latter caught the attention of her neighbors, and she was admitted to the hospital. Ruby's parents kept these details from her for her own sake, but they did eventually take her to visit. Esther had always loved making toys and clothing for Ruby, so when she presented a toy that she had made for her, it didn't raise any concerns. This toy, however, was Mr. Hopp, and we know she did not make it. Eventually, Esther sadly passed on. This unfortunate ending spelled a horrible beginning for Rose, however. Completely foregoing the games this time around, the entity directly chases Rose through her own home with Mr. Hopp, until she finally breaks a toy with her slingshot. There is no good ending to be had here, as the entity appears briefly in the form of Esther and proceeds to give chase themselves, ultimately leading this little girl to decide to burn her house down with her family inside to destroy it. Yikes. If anyone ever needed a time machine, it's Ruby. This is where the story of Mr. Hopp and the entity currently ends, with Mr. Hopp 3 on the horizon. Did the young girl manage to finally put an end to the demon plaguing her family by burning its link to the mortal realm? This unfortunately may not be the case, as Esther, during her journey, learned that the entity required 3 anchors to present itself fully on the mortal plane. The note specifically read, "Do you not see? This is how it was written to be, to give me a hope to live 3 must have somebody to play with. The other 2 toys are still out there, as are Isaac and Molly. And with that, there's always the chance of the entity rising once more. Cheers for now. Until Mr. Hopp's Playhouse 3.